There we go. So the topic that we're talking about tonight is plant identification. And there's lots of aspects to plant identification, and there's always more to learn, and there's never should be any fear of saying, wait a minute, I don't get it. What is that? Why did you know that? It certainly is very something that's often fun to share with other people as you figure out what it is you know and what it is you need to learn. So what we're going to talk about for the next hour is why plant identification is interesting and why sometimes it's really critical. We'll talk about some of the tools that can be used or how we go about identifying plants, talk about some of the botanical terms, some of the botanical aspects that are necessary to understand in order to be able to describe a plant well, some of the tools that we use, and then some examples. And I'm not sure why I added that there, but I think that may have been a plant that we were trying to identify. Oh, I know what that was. A person sent in and said, what is this weed? And until she showed me how large it was, oh, that's the last clock. Sorry about that. There we go, almost. Thank you. Until she showed me how large that was, I wasn't able to identify it. But once I saw the height, that turns out to be something called giant ragweed, which I had not identified until this person brought it to me a couple of years ago. And it was giant ragweed, which is really huge. And there you can see, when you look at the details, you can see the flower that looks a lot like our regular plain old offensive ragweed, but this one happened to be just really large, and it was a new plant to me. So why do we have to care about plant identification? Well, sometimes as gardeners, we just like to know. Sometimes as gardeners, we like to say, well, wait a minute, is this a flower that's cultivated because it's an ornamental and it's going to behave, or is it a wildflower, which a lot of people think of as a weed, which is something that's going to spread by seeds when I'm not sure I want it to, that might spread aggressively by rhizome, and so I want to know what it is before I decide whether I want to plant it or whether I want to propagate it. Certainly, as we learn more about natives and pollinators, we might want to understand whether it's an invasive plant or whether it's a native plant, if we want to plant things that are going to feed our birds and support our pollinators. Until we know what we're working with, we might not be able to look up the details to find out how that plant wants to grow, what the right place is for that right plant. There's a lot of correlation between plants, genus and species, and the pests and diseases that might affect them. And earlier this week, I did a long presentation about being a plant detective in dealing with diagnosing what might be wrong with a plant. And you really have to start with what's the plant. And that's especially true with trees, that's especially true with shrubbery. Until you know what the plant is, you can't identify what the pests or diseases might be of that plant, and then you can't give advice on how you might manage or control that. Sometimes I get calls saying, is this thing edible? And you have no idea until you understand what the plant is. It might be foxgrape, which is beautifully edible, or it might be something which I learned about earlier this year called moonseed, which has a purple fruit, but it only has one seed compared to a foxgrape, which has two, and it has a slightly different leaf, and it's not very edible compared to the foxgrape. You might have a seed that you know, you really need to verify it might be poisonous. It might be something like Jimson weed, which can be very toxic when it's consumed. You might want to identify a plant when you're hiking to say, whoa, wait a minute, I don't want to touch that. It's poison ivy or it's stinging nettles. And like I said, sometimes we're just curious. So there's lots of different reasons why we want to identify plants, and we'll look at some of the tools. So there's lots of different ways that we identify. I get a lot of samples in normal years that come into the lab, and the worst ones are the ones that are a herbaceous perennial, it might be a weed or a wildflower, and it's not in bloom. And you look at it and you think, oh man, I've seen that before. Wait a minute, I've seen it. I can't place it. And if there's other master gardeners in the office, it's always fun to say, hey, Judy, hey, Jeanette, do you know what this is? But there's some favorite books, and books are still a compilation of a lot of information. When you look in a book, you can look at all the different grasses that might be growing in the Northeast, and you can see all the choices that you need to consider. Compared to if you use a computer and say, what is this weed? Well, that's not going to get you anywhere. You can say, what is this grass of the Northeast? And often you're going to get articles written about something compared to information about it. So books give us this is a nice book because it's got a lot of things in color. It shows the seed, it shows the form, it shows the flower, it has it by family. It gives you information about where it grows and how it spreads. And you really can have a lot of good clues that you can use. This is one, you can see how tattered these are. These are from the 1950s. We don't have that many new plants. But this is really cool for me because it shows where it is. Can you see that? It shows where it is. And with the line drawings, sometimes you can see the patterns of the plant and not get distracted by the color of the leaves or the color of the flowers, right? You can use a computer if you know how to learn how to describe something. So all of the plants that we have are subdividable into groups. Trees, which is usually a single strong woody stem and usually tall. Shrubs, which are usually multiple woody stems. Vines, which usually have to climb up over something, or sometimes they can form their own scaffolding, but normally they climb. And then what we call herbs, which are the herbaceous perennials that are the grasses and the flowers and the forbs. And so when you start trying to identify, there are, as an example, tree identification books. You know, you might be able to say, well, I know it's a maple, and then you could type in maple identification, and you might be able to find some things that are online. So understanding whether it's a tree, a shrub, a vine, or an herbaceous perennial is the first sort of sorting that you go through. The next thing is understanding how it grows. And sometimes you don't know how it grows until you identify it. But mostly if someone says, this has been growing on the side of the road, it's probably a weed and it's probably a perennial weed, and you can narrow it down. But in any case, an annual completes its life cycle in 1 year. If you identify a weed, which is an annual, you learn that basically you need to control it before it goes to seed. A biennial tends to be very full with leaves the first year. It often has a taproot. The second year, it tends to go to flower very quickly and go to seed very quickly, and that's the end of its life cycle. So garlic mustard is a biennial. You got 2 years to pull it before it goes to seed, and you can break the cycle of that spreading through your garden. Parsley is a biennial. So the second year you'll get some leaves, but it's going to go to seed fairly quickly, and so that's why you tend to replant parsley every year. A perennial is something whose roots subsist just fine, survive just fine in our winters, and they tend to be long-lived, 3 or often, more often, many more years. Deciduous plants shed their leaves. Trees, shrubs become dormant. Our perennials tend to die back all the way. The deciduous tends to keep their woody bits, and they just shed their leaves. Evergreens are those that never lose all their leaves. You can have broadleaf evergreens that can, the rhododendrons are evergreens, and you can have deciduous conifers like the larch that drop their leaves. And I think also sequoia, the redwood, is a deciduous conifer. But in general, when you look at how it grows, you've got those categories. So then you stop back and you say, where's it growing? If it's in an established ornamental garden, even if it's a garden that probably hasn't been tended for some time, you have different choices than if it's in disturbed soil along the road, which is where we tend to see things like Japanese stiltgrass, which spreads by seed. If you see it in a meadow, you probably are seeing more of our native wildflowers. If you see it in a lawn, you probably are seeing the things we refer to more as weeds, like a dandelion. It certainly still is a native, but they tend to be managed more severely because most people want their lawns to be beautiful and grassy. If you see it in a forest, you've got a clue that it's a shade-loving plant. Whether it's water, some things like European alder likes to grow along a stream, along a pond. Things like Iris pseudochorus, the yellow stream iris, is something that likes wet feet. Aquatics are actually submerged in water. And those characteristics are really important when we look at identifying and managing invasive plants. Knowing where they tend to spread and how they tend to spread helps us manage their invasive tendencies. And then where it's growing in terms of its sun and shade. For those that bloom, the bloom color is really very handy. Trying to identify a plant, herbaceous perennial, when it's not in bloom, as I said earlier, gets a little dicey. But bloom color and shape gives you a really quick handle for most things. For trees, for shrubs, when it's blooming, you've got a lot to go on. This on the bottom here is our American native ironweed. The leaf color, shape, and texture is the next thing you're going to spend a lot of time understanding. When you don't have the bloom, that takes more work. When someone comes in with a branch of a tree and it has leaves on it, you settle back and expect to spend more time because you are really working with the leaves instead of more things. Woody plants, we'll talk about that in a second, but the leaf position is going to really be helpful. And if it's got fruits or nuts on the shrubs and the trees, those are really good clues. If you're identifying plants in winter, we'll talk about bark and leaf scars, but all year round, the bark color and texture is important, and it's especially important when you're looking at things in winter without any leaves on it. And then finally, the height and the breadth gives you a clue. If you're looking at a massive tree, it's going to be different choices than if, example, you're looking at a small weeping crabapple compared to an oak. So the whole structure of the plant is going to be important. When we start describing things and we start describing things to do online queries, or we start guessing and looking up what the description is of something, the terms that are going to be really important, and I'm going to go over these, are opposite, alternate, simple, compound, margin, and venation. All right? Those are going to be important for us to understand in detail because they're the most fundamental in terms of identification. This happens to be a hemlock. No, it's not a hemlock, it's a sumac. That's a sumac there with its nice compound leaves and its red persisting through winter flower. So branching patterns are really important. And this is important especially with, well, it's trees, shrubs, and perennials. Alternate branching means that they sort of zigzag along a stem. This would be where the bud is and you would have a leaf. This would be where the bud is, whoops, and you would have a leaf. Opposite branching is opposite, they're parallel. This would be the pattern for both the leaves, for the twigs, for the branches. Everything you would look at when you would see a branch or a twig, there would be another branch next to it, another twig next to it, another leaf opposite it. This is really important in trees and shrubs. Whorled branching is what you would see less often in trees. You see it more often in herbaceous perennials. So if you've got an herbaceous perennial that's world, that's one of your first online queries, world perennial identification, and you might get lucky. When you look at a tree, this is an example of alternate, opposite, and this is a maple. So everywhere there's a twig, there's another twig. Everywhere there's a leaf opposite it. And the handy term that we use for trees is there's only a few that are opposite, and you use the word mad horse, and it's maple, ash, dogwood, horse chestnut. Some people add cat for catalpa. As soon as you see opposite branching, you've narrowed down the genus and species. This is alternate, so they do that zigzaggy bit. They're alternate through it. And most of the rest of the trees and most shrubs are alternate. Simple versus compound. You have to first look where the bud is, and you then look at the other aspects of the leaf. Now, when there's a bud here, I gotta get my other finger to go away from the little pad. That's when it moves forward. This is where the bud is, and there's one simple leaf. This is where the bud is, and there's many leaflets that are going along that stem. That's a compound leaf. And you can also get doubly compound leaves, where there would be the bud, and there would be a stem, and then there would be stems off that with lots of compound leaves. A few other terms that are important here is the apex, the midvein, the primary veins, the petiole. I showed you the bud, the stem, and then this area here is called the lamina, and this over here, this whole thing is the leaf margin. And we're going to see some definitions that apply to those different things. But when you look at it, it's in its entirety. All these put together are going to help you identify something from a leaf. The petiole, as an example, might be short or long. It might have a color to it. The difference between bittersweet and hardy kiwi is the petiole on the hardy kiwi is red. Everything else looks the same. Hardy kiwi is invasive, as is bittersweet, but that's how you tell them apart. When we look at the leaf margin, we're going to understand what the shape of it is and what the edging of it is. We're going to be, it's really important to understand bark. And I have a few examples, I think, a little bit later. But one of the things to remember is that a lot of younger trees have smooth bark. But as they get older, they get really more distinct bark characteristics. And there are books and there are keys online that let you just define something by its bark. This happens to be tree of heaven, and this bark is described to look like a cantaloupe melon. Fruit, especially on trees and shrubs, helps us also identify. This is the fruit of a sweet gum tree. It persists during winter. It's pretty big. If you step on it, you shriek because it's really sharp, and it sort of looks like a World War II ocean underwater mine. European alder. There are male fruits and female fruits. And this is something that when you look at it in winter or in late summer, the fruits are going to help you understand that. Someone came in, one of the master gardeners, with an apple and said, "Do you know how to identify this apple?" And actually there are online keys that let you identify a tree, an apple tree, by its apple. And it has to do with the length of the stem and the shape of the shoulders and the bud scar on the bottom, and whether it has spots called lenticles, and when you cut it through, what the seeds look like. So you can identify lots of things, especially if you know where to start. So this is some of the details on leaf position. I mentioned it before. These are showing leaf positions, especially on herbaceous perennials. There's the alternate leaves, the opposite leaves, the whorled leaves, and rosette leaves. And especially different wildflowers tend to have more of these whorled and rosette. I told you about that margin, right? And you don't need to memorize the names so much, although a botanist would. But when you're looking at a leaf, you need to realize that there's lots of nuances. And so maybe if you thought, well, I wonder if I have a maple, you would look at maple trees and you would start understanding nuances about their lobes. Maybe if you said, do I have a beech leaf or an elm leaf, you would realize that the veins were going to be a little bit different, and one of them is going to have rounded teeth and one is going to have no teeth. So sometimes when you start understanding that you're getting closer to an identification, you would look up oak leaf botanical description, and you would start seeing these terms, and it would help you understand to look in more detail at the edges of those leaves. Here's the leaf venation. Redbud, as an example, has a very palmate venation. Dogwood, I think, is more parallel. And so again, you understand and you start looking at books specific to tree leaves and look at what their leaf venation is. Flowers are easy when we've got them in flower. There are lots of clues from the flower, what the color and what the shape are. There's a term called regular, that if you cut it through the center, it would be the same on both sides. There are others that would be irregular. There's a lot of work that goes into identifying by the number of petals, and with a genus and species, there are patterns within a family. I think it's Rosaceae is always 5. The way that the flowers are arranged on the stem is also important. So this would be like Queen Anne's lace. And this might be more like goldenrod. And this might be more like monkshood. So different flower arrangements are also key. This could be, as an example, eupatorium. So knowing what characteristics to look at and understanding what some of the terms are, you can better describe it and better search for it. One of the games that we do when we're teaching Master Gardener volunteers training is we have a leaf in a paper bag, and we ask the Master Gardener to describe that leaf to their partner and have the partner try and draw it. And then we teach them terms like entire or crenate or lobed, and you get to do it a second time, and you realize how much more detail you have that you can actually try and draw that. So there's a couple of really good books that are used in terms of plant identification. And the Newcomb's Wildflower Guide here is one that is really useful, but you have to have the tree or the plant in bloom. And I'm going to show you an example of that in just a minute. I had to look at my notes here. So there's a lot of good books, especially good field guides. But as I said, they do usually depend on the thing being in bloom. Dichotomous keys are a tool that they're especially used by botanists, and they're especially used when you really know the details of the plant that you're looking at. And dichotomous means either or, 1, 0. You take this path, or you have this choice, or you have that choice. And you look at characteristics and you understand the either or, and you take a path And each time you take that path, you get closer to the time where you're going to get to the end that says, this is the identity of this plant. It's a really cool tool, and I have to admit that I get lost. And if I get to the end and I've got the wrong answer, I get grumpy because I have to start all over at the beginning. So here's an example of something that's been done that has dichotomous decisions in an online tool. So GoBotany is a website that has a lot of really good information about herbaceous perennials, especially natives, okay? And it's all of New England, so it's applicable to New York too. In this example here, so the first one is this a plant that is usually reproducing by spores and it doesn't have seeds or fruits? And so that's going to be that it's going to be a fern. And what you do is you click on group 1 and it goes off into the ferns, okay? The alternative is if it's not reproducing by spores, it's typically reproducing by seeds. And then you go that way and you can see everything that goes by seed, okay? If it is not having true flowers and the seeds are usually on a scale, then you go to 3 families and it tells you what it is. So I don't have this live here. If I was really clever, I could probably make it live, but you keep answering a set of questions and it takes you down a path that helps you at the end get to the decision, or excuse me, to the definition, the identity of that plant. They can be very good, you can get very good at it, and that's called a dichotomous key. Field guides usually are already organized in a way, and they have a common format, and then you have sections for that common format, and then it has images that go along with it. The flower color, the plant, the leaf. I don't have this one with me, but like the Peterman's field guides or the geographic field guides. And so you open it up and it has all of the red flowers. And then it has the red flowers that are simple or that are complex. So those guides usually are done in the regional areas. They were introduced early on. They were made to be small that you could put in your pocket, and they were very popular to be a field guide that you could go out and you could page through and you could find it. They're good. Sometimes they can help with the most common things, and they don't help if you've got something that's more unusual. And sometimes the ones that were made a long time ago don't necessarily reflect plants that might have moved into our area as we have more invasives or as we have some climate change. This is an example of an Audubon wildflower guide, and this is showing the format at the beginning. And so you have, for each color, you have simple, you have daisy-like, you have odd-shaped, you have elongated clusters, and you have rounded clusters. And so it shows as an example for yellows, this would be the blue example. It shows, I can't read that, larkspur, blazing star, so this probably is the purples. Very useful, very, very good. That's an example of a field guide. This is an example of Taylor's Shrub Guide. Again, it has the definitions of the different types of flowers that can be on a shrub, and then it is organized within those flower types for you to page through and see what you might have in terms of a shrub if it's flowering. This is the example with Newcomb's Wildflower Guide, and it's really, really, really good if the plant is in flower. And what you do is you look over here and you look at the flower type and you pick one of 8 flower types. Does it have irregular? Does it have one part, 3, 4, 5, whoops? Or does it have lots? Or are the flower parts indistinguishable? And you write down a number. Then you go to the plant type. And does it have no leaves, basal leaves, alternate, opposite or whorled, or is it a shrub or a vine? And you write down that number. And then it says, what is the leaf type? Are they entire, which means they're smooth? Are they toothed or lobed, which means they're sort of zigzaggy? Or are they divided? And so you would pick something like, 5, 3, 2. And you'd page into that book, and I don't have it with me, I wish I did. You'd page a few pages up, and it would say, everything 5, 3, 2 is in the Rosaceae family, and go to these pages, and you page through those 3 or 4 pages, and bingo, you have figured out what your plant, what your plant is. If the plant is not in flower, put Newcomb's Wildflower Guide away. But if you have something in flower, it's a really cool book to use and get good at and to carry around with you. Again, it's a field guide. It's sort of a small, book, and you can carry it around with you. So those are kind of just the fundamentals of identification. So let's kind of look at some of these. I mean, here's flowers that are blooming in spring. And the fact that we know that they're in spring gives us pretty good clues to what it is they are. Anyone want to take a shot? Turn yourself off mute and tell me what you think some of these flowers are. You're all out there. You can turn your mic off, or you can hit the space bar. Jeanette, I know who you are. Do you know any of these flowers? Okay.
There's a bunch of bulbs. I think the 3 on the bottom are bulbs.
They are. There's a Crocus Thomasiniana. There's a snowdrop.
Okay.
And Scilla.
Okay.
Okay. The one on the top is a simple oh, come on, Rhinebeck violet. This is colt's foot, which is a plant that comes up with the flower blooming first, then the leaves. It blooms before dandelions do, about 2 weeks before. The leaves look like a colt's foot, which is why it got its nickname. And it spreads by rhizomes in rotten soil, in bad soil. And the only place I had soil brought in when we built the house was in the front of the house where I have plantings. And it has taken me 30 years to get rid of my colt's foot. Not that I don't like that plant, but that's what it is. And the last one on the top right is winter aconite, which I adore. It is not native, it's from Europe. It pops up a little bit, a few days after the colt's foot. It naturalizes, which is fine for me. I have it underneath maple trees because it goes dormant before the maples leaf out. And it blooms in the snow, and I love it because it is just such bright spring. So if you were trying to identify some of these, this is an irregular flower, it's blue, it's spring. This has lots and lots of petals. It doesn't have any leaves, and so you could probably use Newcomb to do that. You get the point. The fact that these are bulbs, there's probably a bulb identification book. You could probably type in small blue bulb flower with 6 petals, and you could probably find that it would tell you Scilla. Summer, a shrub, you would say shrub, fragrant, small purple flowers, attracts butterflies. And you could probably find Buddleia. You might find, looking a little deeper, that you've got Buddleia davidii, depending upon the size of the shrub and the size of the flowers. And Buddleia davidii is one that is becoming invasive here in the lower Hudson. So if you were to find it out in a field and you would say to me, what is that? I would start guessing, and then I would verify Buddleia davidii because it has probably spread by seed, where other species are not as aggressive in spreading by seed. Here we have some zinnias that are annuals, some more zinnias here that are annuals. This is God, I got an aster, excuse me, a small aster, and here we have some sedum, and back there I think also are aster. So you would again by the leaf, by the flower and petals, by when it was blooming, figure that out. When I write Dutchess Dirt, I have a quiz every month, and I say, usually when I'm walking the dogs and I have to worry about making a quiz, I took this photograph and I said, okay, what are these tiny summer weeds that are all blooming at once? And then I had to go and look them up because I had to solve my own quiz. And I had to figure out which leaves were with which flower there. So that leaf is with that little yellow flower, and there's a different leaf there that's with that pink flower, and then this one is here, and I had to look them all up. And we have Scarlet Pimpernel, and we have I can't read that on the bottom, which is Lady's Thumb. And then over here, I forget that one, I can't read it either. That's Black Medic with the yellow, and that ends up getting black seeds. So looking at all the details of this with the books, I could figure out what it is they were, and they were all growing on the side of the road where it was disturbed, and so they're weeds, but I thought that they were pretty. So other things that you need to do in terms of identification are less just for whimsy, but sometimes you need to understand if plants are dangerous, and as I said, if plants are invasive. So does anyone recognize, well, the name's right there, duh. So this plant is really dangerous, and it's called giant hogweed. And giant hogweed is something that if you get sap on your skin, and if you get sunshine on that sap, you get a photophytoesthetic, I didn't say it right, reaction in that your skin actually burns. You have a real burn because the sun burns because of the sap. And giant hogweed is pretty recognizable. If someone calls me up and says, I've got something that's 15 to 20 feet tall, and it's got these huge flowers, it's like Step Far Away, called DEC, and they will send out people in hazmat suits, and they will come and remove it because it's really dangerous. But what about this plant? It has a nice fluffy white flower that's probably an umbral. It has a leaf that's opposite. It has, I'm not sure how I would describe that, but that's the leaf. When you look at where the branches change, this is sort of clasped. And so that's important when you look at the branching structure. Now, here's another plant. The flower looks almost the same. It's just a different color. Is that the same leaf underneath there? Well, it turns out that when you look overall at the plant further down, that has a much different leaf that's lobed, and it's very different here on how it attaches to the stem. And over here, you see again that there's more ridging on the stem, and it's different on how the stem actually branches. Anyone know what these two plants are? So the top one is Queen Anne's lace, and the bottom one is wild parsnip. And wild parsnip is just as dangerous, but in a smaller plant, as giant hogweed. You get the same reaction if you get the sap on your skin and the sun on the sap. So Queen Anne's lace, actually, there's another plant that's similar to Queen Anne's lace called wild chervil, In the summertime on the sides of the road, wild chervil tends to bloom first. That's an invasive. It doesn't cause much harm, but it spreads by seed. And so when they get mowed, that's why you see it on the side of the road, because mowing spreads it. Wild carrot is a native, and it supports a lot of pollinators, and it blooms next. And wild parsnip blooms third. And now I know what to look for, and I can recognize this plant by its seed head at the side of the road, because the seeds are a nice chocolate brown and they persist. And so I've gotten good enough that I can see where the wild parsnip is and where to avoid that, and sometimes advise people to remove it. So whether a plant is dangerous or not is another good reason to identify it. Vegetables. Sometimes we have native versions of vegetables. We've got something called a ground cherry, which is of the same genus as tomatoes and eggplants, and diseases of them can spread through that same genus, through the solanaceous plants. So sometimes if you're growing eggplant and you've got ground cherry out in the field next to it, you probably want to eradicate the ground cherry so it doesn't spread diseases to your vegetables. On the other hand, there's some of our natives that will attract a pest away from your vegetables. So usually we know what we planted because we bought the seeds, but sometimes we have to identify vegetables too. I get calls saying, I have this squash growing from my compost pile. What variety is it? Well, what variety did you grow last year? That's probably the seeds. I'm not going to go into much into shrubs. There's lots of different shrubs. I drive myself goofy because there's a lot of shrubs that have white flowers. And depending upon what their berries turn into, it's hard to figure them out from white flowers. This is winterberry. It's ilex, but it's easier to figure out in fall than it is in summer. So vines, we always want you to know what poison ivy looks like in winter. It climbs with these sort of hairy-like, it grabs with sort of hairs and works its way up the trunk. It also works its way along the forest floor. It is a native, so we don't try and eradicate it because it's not causing harm. We might try and get rid of it because it's causing us annoyance. There's other vines. This is Oriental Bittersweet. And right now it's starting to show its berries. And the berries are a really useful clue, because when you see those berries and you look back at the tree, you'll find that Oriental Bittersweet is a real pest because it climbs by twining and it can girdle the trees that it's climbing on. So when you see these, there is a native bittersweet, but the Oriental Bittersweet has pretty much crowded it out throughout the Northeast. So when you see something like this, you know to go find out whether it's causing any harm to the tree on which it's climbing. The trees are easiest to figure out really when fruits or nuts are present. And you usually can get pretty good at knowing whether it's an oak or a maple or a cherry or a willow, and then you can narrow down the possibilities by looking at a good book. There's very good tree identification books, and if you Google tree identification by leaf, you'll find a lot of good things online. As I said before, you can identify it in winter, but a lot of times why we're identifying the trees is because we really want to understand what pests could bother them. So if someone says, you know, I've got this tree and it's not looking so great, and we turn out that it's an ash, then we need to be very concerned about emerald ash borer. This time of year, if someone says, I've got a tree and it's not looking so great, and it turns out to be a fruit tree, the answer is, well, you know, a lot of fruit trees do have fungal diseases, and if they're dropping their leaves at this point, it's not that big of a problem. But if someone said to me in May, I've got this fruit tree and it's looking pretty nasty, I would say, you've got a real problem because you probably have fungal diseases that overwintered and you need to be proactive about their control because the tree won't survive if it has defoliates year after year. I want to go into a specific example of why some tree identification is important. And that's to also make you understand about a new pest that's coming into our area called spotted lanternfly. And you may have heard about spotted lanternfly, and I wanted you to use that as an example about understanding identification and lookalikes for, in this case, scouting. So spotted lanternfly is a pest that came into our country about 10 years ago and is a real problem for crops. It likes to, it's a subset, it's a leafhopper that sucks the sap, so it can bother fruit trees, it can bother grapevines, it can bother a lot of woodies. And it comes from Asia, where the tree of heaven came years ago. It was brought in ornamentally in the 1800s as an ornamental tree. So now that the pest is here along with the tree that it prefers, we can scout for tree of heaven and then look and see if spotted lanternfly is there. So tree of heaven was introduced on the West Coast and the East Coast in the 1800s and the West Coast in the 1830s to 50s because it's a really beautiful, big, beautiful tree, and it has become invasive. We talked about plant identification, in this case a tree, and we talked about twig arrangement, leaf arrangement, leaf margin, the blossoms, and the seeds. Did I do this right? Yes. So tree of heaven has alternate branching, a blossom, which is a panicle, and I'll show you each of these. It has a compound leaf, and the leaf margin is smooth, it's entire, and the seeds look a lot like a maple seed. They are called a samara. So tree of heaven, this is this large compound leaf. It's very shiny. It has lots of leaflets. But the main thing that you need to remember is when you're looking at a compound tree on a leaf in Dutchess County, you're looking, and if you see this little node, and it looks like my circle moved, if you see this little node here, where's one? Right there, and right there, and right there, and right there, that's tree of heaven, okay? No other compound leaf has a node at the bottom. And that node, by the way, has a gland on it that stinks. And tree of heaven, by the way, not only spreads by seed, but it spreads by its roots sprouting. So wherever you see a big tree of heaven, you see a lot of little goofy Dr. Seuss trees, or the cartoon character on, I don't have his name, but you see lots of other little trees next to it. And that's also key for tree of heaven. The flowers are beautiful. They brought it in ornamentally, and they are male or female because these trees are dioecious. They're male or female, and you'll see colonies of male or colonies of female because of the root sprouting, and then you'll see that pollinators cross them, and you'll see that it is the female trees that form seeds where the male's flowers just drop off. And so they're very distinct when they're blooming in late June, early July-ish. It then has these really beautiful seeds, these samaras, and they are very red in the late summer, and they turn to a beautiful chocolate brown in autumn, and then they get the color of a really lighter brown, and they persist over winter. So if you've ever tried to pick an ornamental shrub, you want year-round interest. Well, this tree has year-round interest. Sadly, it's also spreading. The bark, as I showed you earlier, it looks like it's a cantaloupe. And the bud scar, I think this looks like a little guy's nose in a funny little dwarf's bud or a beard. but this is very distinct, this bud scar. And so when you see, even in winter, you can see tree of heaven. There are other trees that have a compound leaf, but they don't have that node. So this is sumac, and it has a cluster of berries that persist. And I can't tell you, this is so simple. When I was trying to get invasive leaves for one of my classes early on, I was finding things that told me to count the leaflets and look for whether it was fuzzy, and that's nonsense. All you have to do is see whether there's a gland or not. Black walnut, it has totally different bark. It has a compound leaf. It has different fruit. So in the summertime, in the wintertime, you can see the difference. So with plant identification, there's a lot of reasons that we do it. We might do it out of amusement. We might do it out of need. We might do it out of fear if something is harmful. Understand what you're looking at. Understand how to describe it. Realize that there's a lot of different tools. They could be books. They could be online tools. Sometimes you need to put it down and come back later and look. It's fun to ask a friend, ask an expert, look in a book. There are ways that you can get clever with queries. Sometimes you need to form the question. As I said, maple leaf or maple identification by bark, or vine identification of the Northeast. And what we like to type in with Master Gardeners is we like to type in site:/.edu. And so you tend to get things that are more research-based, or site:/.org, because those are sites that are providing more information rather than trying to sell you stuff. Illinois Wildflower is a really good source for wildflower information. Once you get close, you can type in the plant that you think it is, and it not only tells you the characteristics, but in the end, it tells you what similar lookalikes are, and you can maybe go look at them. So there's a lot of different tools that you can use as you start gaining experience for your plant identification. And that is what I prepared tonight. That's my backyard. And a couple of years ago, and those are Japanese maples of a few different types that are either weeping or are standing. And I think that that's a juniper back there, and that's a lot of deciduous trees. The native trees drop their leaves before the introduced trees, by the way. That's why these leaves are all off and these are still persisting. So, are there any questions?
I don't have a question, but I want to say thank you. That was really amazing stuff.
Well, good.